Nice to see you all. My name is Avi Picard. I am from the Department of Israel Study and Archaeology, and my talk will deal about the end of the period we are dealing with in the department. As I mentioned, some of us deal with prehistoria, some of us deal with antiquity, Iron Age, Middle Ages, like the last two talks, and some of us deal with modern Israel and modern Zionism. And in the row, I think I am at the end because I will really deal with the 1950s and 60s and even in the 70s and 80s. Some will even dare to say that that's not history. But our talk today will deal with one of the major points of the founding of Israel, and this is the question of immigration. I will go into some details, and I will try to put in context what was the reason and what was the influence of the large immigration that took place in Israel during Israel's first years. I took the example of Ellis Island, the entry station of immigrants in the US. Many things compare, or many historians, many events, we can compare Israel with the United States regarding immigration. And I will, in this talk, perhaps emphasize those things were different. And definitely saying that Shaar HaAliyah is Ellis Island is not exactly the case. Now, before we go into details, we need to understand the large picture. The establishment of the State of Israel started immediately, the day after the Declaration of Independence, or one day after, two ships arrived. And even during Israel's first 7 months, that was a bitter war, 100,000 immigrants arrived. 100,000 immigrants to a population of 650,000 Jews. So about the population needed to double itself, but then 1949, 250,000 immigrants arrived. In 1950, 170,000. In 1951, 150,000. So the numbers are huge. And it seems like there was an instruction from who knows where, and perhaps we'll go and understand from where, hundreds of thousands of Jews from different countries flowed the shore of Israel by planes, by boats. They doubled the population in a short time, changed completely Israel's demographic composition. We will talk a little bit about the relationship and the tension between Jews from Europe, Ashkenazi Jews, and Jews from the Middle East, some known as Sephardic Jews. And definitely the country faced very, very large difficulties in economic and social topic or challenges. And I will try to understand why Israel accepted this huge wave of immigration, if it was such a natural idea or such an obvious reason that that's the idea, or it took some discussion, challenges, and talks to understand why should Israel accept such a large immigration population. Now, I will show during this movie, and that's perhaps the advantage of being an historian of modern time, so that I can show movies. This is a part of a propaganda movie. Some will say perhaps a movie. Those movies were created for fundraising, especially in English-speaking countries. And for me, as an historian, as a researcher, it is helpful to look and see how the people wanted to colorize, to picturize this idea. We'll show now a short clip just to get into the atmosphere of the time. This movie was made in 1951, actually define the period I'm talking about, and it can be found on the great channel of the Spielberg Archive of Jewish Movies from the Hebrew University. Erez will be kind enough to put the link on the chat, and I will show the movie from now.
In the harbor of Haifa, you watch them come in. They've come across 3 continents, 5 seas, and too many rivers to remember.
Ingenieur Kutzlein, ich kann ihn nicht sehen.
And on the docks of Haifa, they know that one stage in their long journey has ended. Now, for the first time, they're told and they feel the words in the very air about them, "We want you here."
Okay, so those last scene are not from the port of Haifa, but rather from the camp known as Shaar HaAliyah, the gate of immigration. And later on, we will understand what happened there and why those immigrants had to be sent to this camp. But I don't know if you put attention, one word that was in the beginning of the movie was the word quarantine, meaning, no, you arrive from abroad, you need to be in a close camp and not get out. If we had talked about it like 5 months ago, it seems, no, an historic period. Now we are living in a period that's what happened when people are crossing the border from one country to another. So definitely we understand the issue. Now we are using the word aliyah, not immigration many times. Definitely in Hebrew, the word immigration in Hebrew should be translated to hagira. Some scholars do use the word hagira in Hebrew regarding Jewish immigration, and there are some difference, and I will sometimes move between those terms. Aliyah literally is sent going up, and this is the Hebrew term for immigration by Jews. It's at a religious point of view, saying you are going to the land of Israel that is more holy than other lands. And it also has a political meaning from the point of view of Zionism, saying that this is the positive thing to do, going up to the land of Israel, to the state of Israel, and leaving the country of Israel, it's negative. It's definitely at a negative point of view. Now, as you know, Israel is not the only immigration country in the world. And there are other immigration countries. What is the reason why countries do accept immigrants and sometimes even encourage immigration? Definitely in the early 20th century, that was definitely the case of many, many countries. In the 19th century, the US encourage immigration, why they do so. So most known country of immigration, the US, Canada, Argentina, Australia. And why does they encourage immigration? So usually there are countries with a lot of resource and little population. In the area known today as the United States of America, before the arriving of Europeans, there were about 2 million Native Americans. Definitely a large country with a lot of resource and little population. Another reason to encourage immigration, and sometimes, and we know it also regarding Israel and other countries, that are needed workers and people who are needed as employees in particular field that the host country do not have enough people to work there. And those countries, immigration countries, have also good reason to limit immigration. This cartoon is from the 20s when the United States decided to limit immigration from Europe. And you see those quota of 3% from each country in earlier census. And the idea behind those limitations were that those immigrants will harm the economy. If the reason to encourage immigration is the contribution of those immigrants to the economy, if those immigrants are ill or elder, or will perhaps take jobs from the current inhabitant of the country, so this is a good reason to prevent their immigration. And that's the US in the 1920s, and that's Argentina in the 1930s. And usually today is the main reason for many, many countries to limit immigration. Those immigrants are taking the jobs of our citizens, and that's why we don't want to let them in. Another restriction of immigrants, less common in the second half of the 20th century, and definitely have less legitimation, but very, very powerful in many, many years of immigration, was the concern about the identity of the host country. Australia, for example, had until 1970 a policy that encouraged immigration, but only white immigration, policy known as White Australia. And the idea was that we Australians are actually in the Far East. Definitely, if we want limit the immigration to European immigrants, we will be blown up by Chinese and Indonesian and so on. In our terms, it's definitely wrong to limit immigration according to race, ethnicity, religion, but this was definitely a case in many countries. The United States restricted immigration of Chinese from 1882 and restricted immigration from people not from Europe. And even in Europe, they preferred those who are coming from North and West Europe, like Germany and France, rather than those who are coming from South Europe, like Spain and Italy, or East Europe, like Poland, mean Jews and Catholics. Argentina, that really encouraged European immigration for decades because they wanted to become the United States of South America. And I don't know how familiar people are with Argentina, but Argentina is the last Native American country in Latin America. The majority of its population are descendants of immigrants. But by the 1930s, they realized that many immigrants are Jews leaving Europe from the fear of the Nazis. Many of them hold perhaps communist attitude and so on, and they limit immigration based on ethnicity, religion, political view, and so on. And those are restrictions on immigration known in history of immigration countries. Did Israel ever limit immigration of Jews? So actually it did, but we won't go into details here. But definitely this is the larger perspective that we need to look into the policy of Aliyah, of immigration in Israel. Now, regarding this issue, is Israel an immigration country? We need to look at another type of immigration countries, immigration of return. And from this point of view, this policy of return, Israel is not unique in adopting this policy. There are other states that are accepting immigrants, but from different reasons. Usually, this country of those immigration of return are taking place when the nation boundaries and the country or the state borders do not overlap, meaning there are people who are part of the nation, but are not part of the citizen of the country. Now, I know that in English, the question of nationality is sometimes kind of a complex understanding. Why? Because I know from my experience in the US, when people ask your nationality, they're asking for your citizenship. Actually, people can have Iraqi citizenship, but their nationality will be Kurds. They are living in Iraq, but they are citizens of Iraq, but they don't feel part of the Iraqi people that actually did not really existed before World War I, but part of the Kurdish people. And this is the case with other countries. Some countries do limited their nationality to their borders, but other countries look at their nationality in a broader way. We call it sometimes in research ethnic nationality. And from this point of view, Israel is not alone. And the Jewish people is not unique in its definition, called by the researcher, the scholar of nationalism, Ernest Gellner, diaspora nationalism. And he said that 3 examples we can think about of Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, that there are people that are dispersed all over the world or all over Europe until the 1920s. Many of the Greeks did not live in modern Greece. Until today, many of the Armenians do not live in Armenia. And as we know, many of the Jews don't live in the Jewish state. Those diaspora nationalism had a policy saying when we will have our own country, this country will be open to our nation members. Sometimes the reason to found this nation state is because those people are being persecuted. And this is the case of the Jews, but the Jews are not the only one. Sometimes you can think about the Greeks that also were persecuted in the Ottoman Empire and decided we need to have our own nation country. But laws of returns or policy of returns we can find in Ukraine, in Ireland, in Bulgaria, in Germany, Hungary, Slovenia, Slovakia, Poland, Finland, Czech Republic, Croatia, and Russia. And many other countries have laws that actually facilitate overseas nationals to become citizen. If an American who his ancestors immigrate from Ireland before Ireland was an independent country, so he never had Irish citizenship. If he wants to immigrate to Ireland and become an Irish citizen, it's easier for him than for another American that doesn't have Irish roots. And this is definitely a policy of a return. If we mention that in countries of immigration, the ethnicity of the immigrants could be an obstacle for the accepting of those immigrants. If Argentina doesn't want Jews and the United States doesn't want Catholics or Chinese or so on, in return countries, the ethnicity or the nationality of the immigrants, if they are from the right nationality, are the reason why they are accepted and why the country accept them as citizen. So ethnicity is the main criteria for their return or their immigration, and not their contribution to the economy. And the state of Israel, and that will be our last slide, is an extreme example. As I mentioned, it's not the only country in the world that has return policy, but we will see the measure taken by Israel, and as far as I know, no other repatriation policy had taken those measures to accept the nation members in its own country. If we go back to history of Zionism, one of the major purposes of Zionism was to move Jews from abroad to the land of Israel, the exodus of Jews. But why this exodus, or how this exodus was justified? We see two major objectives of why should Aliyah be accepted or been encouraged. The one we can title as rescue, arguing that Zionism should provide safe haven for Jews because they were persecuted all over the world. Based on this idea, all Jews who are interested in coming to the Jewish state should be allowed to come. However, some will say that there are other reasons for immigration, and that will be titled under building, saying, look, to establish a new Jewish society, to establish a Jewish national home in Palestine, in the land of Israel, we need to build an infrastructure, an economic infrastructure. And therefore, we need to have immigrants that can contribute to the developing of the country, developing of the land of Israel, developing farmers, those who can found new settlements, and so on. Those two reasons can be actually going together. Those pioneers who are coming to found this new society are Jews who are being persecuted. So therefore, the State of Israel and earlier the Zionist movement should accept them. But what about Jews who are actually being persecuted but do not contribute to the economy? Elder, sick, those who have perhaps different ideas than becoming farmers. And this is perhaps the idea that from the point of view of building, immigration, even Jewish immigration, should be controlled and measured. And for many years, this was the idea. And if we will try to put it in a chart, between rescuing or building, we have two solutions. If we think that the aim of Aliyah is rescuing Jews, the conclusion will be that we should have mass Aliyah. If we think that the aim of Aliyah is building the country, so immigration should be selective. Those immigrants should be young, healthy, and willing to contribute to the building of this new society. So the idea that Israel always had a policy that its gates are wide open to every needed Jew is not completely accurate. Until the late 1930s, most Zionist leaders believed that the Jewish immigration should focus on pioneers, that mostly pioneers and those who prepared themselves for years mostly in Europe, some of them in other areas, should come to Israel. And the leaders of Israel came from those pioneers. If we can think about Ben-Gurion, or Eshkol, or Golda Meir, the first three prime ministers of Israel, they all came as young people, as pioneers, full with idealism. And this was perhaps the leading echelon of the Israeli society. What changed in the late 30s, and especially during the 1940s? And definitely the main reason was the understanding that, or perhaps I will put it differently. Although the founder of Zionism, Herzl, justified the idea of a Jewish state by anti-Semitism, saying why we need a Jewish state, because Jews are persecuted. During Zionism's first 50 years, people said, you are right, but we don't have enough power, resources, land to accept all Jews. Needed Jews, those who need to be saved, can find themselves a safe haven elsewhere. And this discussion took place in the first decade of the 20th century, in the question that Herzl was proposed a Jewish state in Africa, in a place he called Uganda. Now we know it's actually in Kenya. And he said, Jews need to have safe haven. We cannot have it in the land of Israel. Let's take Uganda. And a big part of the Zionists say, we are not dreaming about a safe haven everywhere. We are dreaming about the land of Israel. And if we cannot have the land of Israel now, we will wait. And if Jews are being persecuted, they can go elsewhere. So the attitude of Zionism was that the most important things is to have the land of Israel in different ways. And perhaps later on, we'll be strong enough to accept all needed Jews. And for, I mentioned decades, the main policy was we need only pioneers. during the 1940s, we facing what is going in Europe and the mass murder, the Holocaust, the extermination of actually 2/3 of the Jewish people in Europe, the Zionists realized that they cannot postpone putting the option of Israel as the only safe haven for Jews. And although we think it was always the issue, it was not like this. And for years, decades, the Zionists said, as of now, we need only pioneers. But in the 40s, they said, when we will have the authority about immigration to the land of Israel, because during the 1940s, the authority was under British hands, and the British limited immigration, Jewish immigration, because the fear of the Arab revolt. When we will have it, and what we are asking from the international community is to make Israel the refugee camp for all Jews in the world. And they actually formulate a proposition to the international community saying, look, we can create or make the land of Israel, even before having an independent Jewish state, we can make the land of Israel a huge refugee camp for all needed Jews. In 1942 and 43, when they put up this plan, they didn't know how many Jews will be killed by the Nazis. And some of them say, even if I'm exaggerating, and 1 million Jews will be killed, those who will remain will need to find a place, and they cannot go back to their places. As we know, unfortunately, they didn't exaggerate about putting the number of 1 million Jews. They didn't understand that the number will be 6 times greater. But the plan was that there will be 1 or 2 million Jewish refugees that won't have any place to go to, and the Zionist movement should offer the state of Israel as the safe haven for those people. And as Ben-Gurion put it, even if it required soup kitchen, we don't think about economy as we thought about it in the 1920s and 30s, that we need to have enough resources to make all those people work and to be able to produce food and housing for all those people. Say, no, it will be a refugee camp. It require soup kitchen, but those refugees won't be in refugee camps in Europe. They will be in refugee camps in the land of Israel. The idea of this proposition was that it will take place before statehood. However, before having a Jewish independent state, and it will facilitate having an independent Jewish state because there will be a Jewish majority in the land of Israel. History changed or moved differently, and there was a bitter fight between the Zionist movement and the British mandate. And after the British realized that they cannot find a solution between the demands of the Americans to allow Jewish refugees to go to the land of Israel and the demand of the Arabs not to allow this immigration, they decided to move the problem of Palestine to the UN. The UN decided, the United Nations decided about having a Jewish and Arab state, and the Jewish independent state was declared May 14, 1948. In its declaration of independence, free Jewish immigration was the first principle of the new state, saying the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the integrating of the exiles. There was no law yet because they couldn't find a compromise to have a law of citizenship that gives citizenship only for Jews, because from the point of view of democratic countries, you cannot have laws that are based on religion and ethnicity. 2 years later, in 1950, they find a solution and say the law of citizenship is neutral, and say that everybody who was born in the land of Israel is a citizen, and everybody who is entering as an ole. And there was another law called the law of return, defining who is a ole, who is an immigrant. And in this law that passed in the summer of 1950, in the day the celebration of Zionism, before the Declaration of Independence, the day of Zionism was the 20th of month Tammuz. This was the day Herzl, the founder of Zionism, passed away. And they passed the law in this same day. It was definitely a kind of a celebration. And in this law, they said that Aliyah is not regular immigration, but it is the natural right of Jews returning to their home, a right that no one can take from them. So it's not something that the country gives to those immigrants. It's not a right that other, like Argentina or Australia, gives to other people the right to immigrate. This is a right that the country do not give them. They had it before the country. And as Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, phrased it, he said, it does not stipulate that the state of Israel grants diaspora Jews the right to settle here, but rather that this right is secured by their being Jews. This right preceded the state of Israel, and this is the right that built the state. And basically, the law of return or accepting Jewish immigration was the raison d'etre, the reason and the justification to have a Jewish state in Palestine. Jews have been persecuted all over in the world. They need to have a safe haven, and this safe haven is the state of the Jews in the land of Israel. As we show later, earlier, it was not so clear that the state of Israel will adopt a policy saying the gates are wide open. There are good reasons to prevent large immigration, because if you accept this kind of a large immigration with all the elders and sick and problems of Jewish communities all over the world, actually a poor state just recovering from a very bitter war, we need to find ways to cope with those challenges. And it's completely logic saying, look, we are actually a safe haven for all Jews, but due to our economic situation, we are not accepting all needed Jews to come to Israel, and we are looking for those who can contribute to the country economy. Now I want to add, and this was not the policy that was decided on. The policy that was decided on, we are accepting all immigrants without any limitation. And how can we find resources and money? Well, as we say in Hebrew, yeh beseder. There was no real plan for how Israel can find it. Actually, many Israelis believed that there will be large immigration, but not as large as it was before. They said, look, Jews of the diaspora will realize that the situation here is difficult, and they will wait until they decide to come. However, this was not the case. and a country after country face an emergency situation, or the Jewish community in those countries faced emergency situation, and the flood of immigration did not stop. Now, I want to add another point that is important to understand what happened in Israel, and this is the Jews from the Islamic world. Until the 1940s, the Aliyah from Islamic countries, and I think I'm talking from Morocco to Iran, including Turkey and Egypt and Syria and Yemen and so on, about 11 countries. Those Jews were pioneers. A kind of Orientalism also influenced Zionists to try not to prevent their immigration, but not to encourage it so much. During World War II, the Zionist orientation changed. They realized that they must include the Jews from the Islamic world, the Jews from Asia and Africa, or Middle East and North Africa, in the plans of Zionists. First of all, because if the Jews or the Zionists want to have a Jewish majority in the land of Israel, Jews who remain in Europe, the survivor of Holocaust, are so few, it won't be enough to create a Jewish majority, especially if the Jews of the Soviet Union are prevented to leave the Soviet Union, and the Jews of America and Western Europe can come to the land of Israel, but they will choose not to go to. So the Zionist movement needs to have human resources elsewhere. But it was not the only reason, and some will perhaps say it's a kind of cynical reason, because when they needed to come, we didn't want them, but when we need them, we welcome them. But there was other reason, and it's important to understand, until the 1940s, the Jews of the Middle East did not face anti-Semitism. Although they were perhaps not equal citizens in Arab countries, but comparing to Eastern and later on Central Europe, anti-Semitism had less importance, and nobody thought that those Jews need to be rescued, that they are looking for a safe haven. What happened in the 1940s, that for different reasons, I will not go into details now, the anti-Semitism was brought to Arab countries. Definitely the Jewish-Arab conflict in Palestine that increased the tension between Jews and Arab influenced the attitude toward Jews in Muslim countries. And it was clear that Jews in Arab countries need to be rescued as well. And if we look at the demography of Jews in Arab country, it's clear. Before the creation of the State of Israel, there was 1 million Jews in Arab country. In some sources, many call them the forgotten Jews, because they were not so much taking into account the forgotten million. But 1 million Jews, it's about 7% before the Holocaust. Before the Holocaust, we are talking about 16 million Jews in the world, and those Jews were less than 1 million. After the Holocaust, we are talking about 10 million Jews in the world, and those Jews are about 1 million, so it's about 10% of the Jewish people. As we can see, as of now, those Jewish community disappear. The last two, perhaps three large community still in the Muslim world are Iran and Turkey, that are not Arab countries, and for years were not so much hostile to Israel, and Morocco with about 2,100 Jews. But look at the numbers, and you can see clearly that those community completely disappear. Most of them moved to Israel, about a quarter of the Jews from Arab countries move elsewhere, especially to Europe, and some to South and North America. But the immigration of the Jews of North Africa and Middle East completely make those communities completely empty. If we are looking on the numbers of Jews arriving in the first years of independence, we can see that the large communities are Iraqi Jews, Romanian Jews, and Polish Jews. And if we are trying to understand based on, we could say what happened that Israel decided to adopt the principle of rescue and to adopt what a researcher called Esther Meir called the Eastern orientation, and a flow of almost 700,000 immigrants arrived in 3 years. And if for decades Zionists were against mass immigration because it will make the economy to crash, that's definitely what happened when these masses arrived. Another problem arose was that having this large proportion of immigrants from Arab countries will change Israel's identity, and from being a Western country or a European isle in the Middle East, Israel is becoming a different country. And from the point of view of veteran Israelis, it was a kind of a threat. Now, today, in the 21st century, we can perhaps call it or define it as racism. But if, as historian, we're trying to understand what worked in those years, we can look at this chart and see this is the Jewish people, world Jewry, as known by 1948. This is the immigration to Israel in those same years. Definitely, from the point of view of veteran Israeli, it was a kind of a threat. And people were feared that the character of the Yishuv, of the Jewish community in Israel, will change. And some will say we will establish 11 people instead of a nation characterized by the Goldie image of the Hebrew labor movement. Definitely a kind of a fear. I will show now a short minute of this same movie about accepting those immigrants in the place called Shaar HaAliyah, and we later on say few words about how those immigrants were gathered or dwelled.
Through this reception camp pass almost 1,000 people a day. Each one has his own idea of what he wants to do or where he wants to go. And here begins the task of merging these 1,000 hopes and dreams with the needs of the new state. Sometimes it's easy, as with Nagi. He's young and willing, and he'll go anywhere.
I want to work. You want to work? Yes. First, you must learn our language. Learn Hebrew. Yes. Then how can I do? What can I do? Take this one to number 972, and they will do everything for you. Thanks.
It's going to be harder with him. He wants a steady job near a big city, the kind of life he's been accustomed to.
By the way, sunt cel mai fericit om al statului Israel, că am călcat pe pământul Israelului astăzi.
This woman and her husband would like to settle in Haifa.
Je ne peux pas le faire, madame, croyez-moi.
Mais qu'est-ce que je peux faire quand mon mari a de travail à Haïfa?
هذيك الساعة خليها الساعة لا لابد نقيد باش تاخذ الوقت الأكل حل بعد كويس ما تيجي ما تيجي عندي بعد بكرة وتتحنى مردخاي مردخاي كرباشي ما يفوتها من فرد.
And so they come. The shepherds, the shoemakers, the rabbis, the students. Somehow each of them must be found a home, to do a job, to help build a new nation which is in the making.
Okay, so actually the flood of immigrants arriving in the state of Israel was sent to camps all over the country. Those were kind of refugee camps. Many families living in the same tent or the same shack. In many cases, though, those were old British army camps. And in those countries, in those camps, because of health reason, fear of sickness, and other reason, the immigrants could not go and live and could not work. The main camp and the first station for those immigrants was Shaar HaAliyah, Immigration Gate. It's not exactly Ellis Island, because Ellis Island was a station that people passed for a few hours. In Shaar HaAliyah, immigrants stayed for a few weeks sometimes, until they were sent to another place. After a year and a half of filling the country with these refugee camps and having more than 100,000 people in refugee camps, another plan started, and the plan was called transit camps, or ma'abarot in Hebrew. The idea was that the state of Israel, or the Jewish agency for this reason, cannot hold so many people that are not working. And they will build new neighborhoods. However, how can they build new neighborhoods without no resources? So they decided to build new neighborhoods without any resources. This will be temporary situation, temporary housing, temporary location. They were able to found old tents from the different allies army in Europe, army tents, and some material, and actually build about 150 ma'abarot like that all over the country. They started to establish them by May 1950. Some of the immigrants were able to find housing in other places. Some stayed in the ma'abarot for years. And many places that there was no plan to have there a town became a town because it was a temporary ma'abara who stayed there. The majority of those ma'abarot were placed in the center near existing towns that will allow those immigrants to find work in the existing economy and to receive education, health, and other services from a township and kibbutzim and other places among the veterans Israelis. Now, Israel policy, as I mentioned, was not just a return policy. Israel did not allow Jews to come. Israel encouraged Jews all over the world to come. It organized their immigration. Israel said that built camps in Morocco and in Yemen and in France as a mid-station for North African Jews, and in all over the world to help Jews. Israel, with the help of the world Jewry through the organization called, until today, the Joint, actually financed the immigration of those Jews who are actually refugees without any resources. Somebody needed to help them to move. And upon their arrival, Israel provide them with housing, as we saw, sometimes temporary, employment, and healthcare. It's not the case with any immigration countries. When someone become an immigrant to America or Argentina, he should take care of himself. Even in return countries, for example, Greece, the country did not host those immigrants as Israel did. And the 7,000 immigrants who arrived by the end of 1951 were welcomed by 150,000 Jews. So actually, it's more than doubled the population. Never in human history this kind of immigration happened. I looked into details. After World War I, for example, 1.5 million Greeks left the area of modern Turkey and moved to Greece. But these 1.5 million Greeks were welcomed by about 6 million Greeks in Greece. 1 million Soviet Jews moved to Israel in the 1990s, but they were welcomed by 5 million Jews in Israel. In the 3 years of the mass immigration, a small population, and actually 1/3 of these 650,000 Jews were immigrants living in Israel less than 10 years. They welcomed the population that doubled themselves. And there is no precedent in world history for population that absorb immigration in such a magnitude. So the next talks, and I will be open to question, the next talk in our series is my colleagues, Dr. Amit Dagan, who will talk Sunday in a way about the history of archaeology in Israel, and I do recommend because Amit is always very, very interesting. So now, Erez or Shem Tov, if you can share with me questions or open the mic, I will be happy to answer.
You have 2 questions in the chat bot, if you can read them. If not, I can pass them again.
Okay, what is the Zionist idea in the 21st century? I'm an historian, and this is definitely a question for politicians. I can say my own ideas, but I'm not sure that this is, my ideas are better than others. I do agree that after 1991, there are very few Jews being persecuted. Until 1991, there were still in the world Jews that were looking for safe haven, and the state of Israel was there for them. If it will happen again, I don't know. As I said, I'm an historian. We can say something about the past. I don't think we can say something about the future. Other question? Perhaps I missed something.
Yeah, I'm just
quick discuss the change brought about the Russian immigration. Okay. Russian immigration arrived to a different Israel. Many things changed. It was more a powerful and wealthy country. The idea that definitely influenced the accepting of immigrants in the 1950s, the idea of a melting pot, that we need to force those new immigrants to accept the values and the behavior of the veterans, because this is the only way to become Israelis. They need to change their first names and sometimes even their last names, was not the case in the 1990s when the Russian immigration arrived. Israel moved from a melting pot policy to a salad bar policy, saying that, you know what, that's okay. Everybody can stay with their language, their culture, their enclaves. Definitely the Russian immigration changed Israel, but we can find the answer in other scholars. Perhaps it's a little bit early to understand it. And then one major point, when we're thinking about Israeli cuisine, it's clear that the immigration of Middle Eastern Jews influenced Israeli cuisine. When we think about Israeli music, it's clear that Middle Eastern Jews influence Israeli music. Did Russian Jews influence Israeli cuisine and Israeli music? We cannot see it yet. So perhaps it's early to say. Other questions? Okay, see again about the Russian immigration. When the North American will come, I cannot say anything about it. When did the last Ma'abarot camps close? So actually from 1952 and on, the policy was to try not to build new Ma'abarot and to try to move immigrants into permanent housing. In some cases, some wanted to stay in the Ma'abara because they actually had free housing. And we know that in some places in Jerusalem, in some places in Holon, we still had one shack here, one barrack there, of someone who refused to move to a house that he will need to pay rent for and prefer to stay in this bad condition. But I don't think there were any Ma'abarot, and definitely if we had 250,000 people in the Ma'abarot in 1952, the numbers went down during the 1950s. It was reopened in the early 1960s with the Moroccan immigration, but then even though with small numbers and without tents, better conditions, but the Ma'abarot do not exist anymore. And I think the last shack was put down in the 1970s. Today, I am a member in a staff trying to build a museum of those Ma'abarot, and we couldn't find anywhere the original barrack of those Ma'abarot. So that's about it. Didn't Russian immigration hasten the change of Israel to high-tech economy? Well, definitely Russian immigrants influence Israel being a startup nation in many ways. I think that big part of it is the military that force it. And again, I'm not an expert about it. But I, from the point of view of ethnicity, for many years, there was in Israel a kind of an equation that Jews from the Middle East and North Africa are poor, uneducated, and right-wing. And Jews from Europe are middle class, educated, and left-wing. And the Russian came and they completely changed the equation because there were Ashkenazi Jews who were poor and educated, secular and right-wing. And this was definitely something new for the Israelis. And this is definitely a change in Israel society. Any other question? I missed anything? No. Can allow people open the mic, Erez, if they want to ask a question?
I will let...
Wait a minute, I can perhaps do it?
They can have now the option to open the mic if they want.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for listening. Have a Chag Shavuot Sameach. We will see you next Sunday with the talk of our colleague, Amit Dagan. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening.